Good morning to all of you. I'm Kim Baldasano together with Claro Garapan, Lance Balbuena, Rain Manginsay, and Karen Villaluna are going to discuss with you today the taxation in Spanish Philippines and the taxation under the Americans. Further in the discussion, we will also tackle concepts that would give you some insights about the state of taxation in the Philippines pre and during colonial period. First, let us define what taxation is. A government mechanism to raise funds. The government raises revenue from the people they govern to be able to function fully. Basically, it is the means of sustaining the government and its constituents through, for example, giving health care, maintaining stable economy, providing jobs, food security, and such which are only possible through the funds collected from the people. Before the colonization, Philippines have already established a what we call subsistence economy, which is in definition an economy which is not based on money, in which buying and selling are absent, or rudimentary through barter may occur, and which commonly provides a minimal standard of living. During this time, datus ruled over the various kingdoms called the barangays, and these datus offered protection to its subordinates. The payment of tribute or taxes were already present. The tax, called buwis or handog, came in the form of crops or goods, which the people living under the datu share a portion of harvest or property, in exchange for security and protection. It is also important to note here that only the timawa or the freemen pay taxes, while the oripon or oripon, the slaves at the time who couldn't offer anything, give tributes in the form of service. Hence, maharlikas or nobility in the datus and the lowest of the caste were the exempted from the tax payment. This exemption will still be present during the Spanish colonization. Now, we tackle the taxation in the Spanish Philippines, where we will talk about the tributos and reduction. First is the payment of tributos, and its purpose is to generate resources to finance the maintenance of the islands. This is when Filipinos were compelled to pay tribute, called tributo in Spanish, to the colonial government. It was imposed as a sign of loyalty to the King of Spain. The individuals ages 16 to 60 years old were required to pay 8 reales, the unit of currency in Spain, which is equivalent to 1 peso per year, from 1571 to 1884. There were also other forms of payment, which were gold, chickens, textiles, cottons, and rice. Aside from tributos, the system of reduction were also established. Reduction aimed to consolidate colonial control over Philippine indigenous communities by compelling prominent individuals to relocate into poblaciones, or town centers, within hearing distance of church bells. Bell ringing ordered daily life by signaling times to congregate and by marking special occasions. To further the political control, economic exploitation, and evangelization, pueblos were created, where Filipinos were gathered and awarded plots of land to till. Pueblo encompassed both settled and unsettled districts within its geographical boundaries. It is a kind of settlement and was mandated by Spanish colonial laws. The creation of pueblos had been attributed to the missionaries because it was their task to create Christianized communities or settlements. Now let's talk about who are the principales. It is the distinction or status of being part of the Principalia, which was a hereditary right. However, it could also be acquired. The principales formed a privileged group who were exempted from tribute paying and polo services. These principales were the alcaldes, gobernadores or town mayors, cabezas de barangay, or head of the barangays, soldiers, members of the civil guard, government officials, and vagrants, or the undesirables, social outcasts, which are the terms that describe the condition of many Chinese people in the Philippines during the late Spanish era. The principales trace their origin from the pre-colonial royal and noble class of Datu of the established kingdoms, which, as I've said, were also exempted in paying tributes. The members of this class enjoyed exclusive privileges in which were only the members of Principalia were allowed to vote, be elected to public office, and be addressed by the title Don or Doña. Next is the galleon trade, which is also known as galleon trade or Manila-Acapulco trade. A galleon is a sailing ship used especially by Spain from 15th to through 17th centuries, originally as a warship, but later for trade. The galleons carried spices, porcelain, ivory, lacquerwares, and silk to be sold in Mexico. However, only the elite benefited from this trade, because people needed to buy boleta. The person who has a boleta is allowed to engage in galleon trade. A boleta was a ticket that entitles a person to ship goods to Mexico. Traders who do not have enough money to buy a boleta will borrow money from Spanish friars. It was a very profitable venture for the Spanish merchants, but the government find it a source of corruption. Its good effects are it increases the government's revenue, it conserves natural resources for the future, and it developed good relationship between countries. The bad effects, however, are neglect to local products, and Filipinos became poorer. That is all for my part. Now let's have Mr. Claro Garapan to discuss other points in the Spanish colonial era.
Thank you, Kim. Now let's proceed to the next part of the discussion, which is Cedula Personal. In the Philippines, the term Cedula Personal refers to a personal identification document or community tax certificate. The cedula was issued annually and served as proof of residence and payment of the required tax. During the Spanish colonial period starting in the 16th century, Cedula Personal was first introduced as a means of tracking and controlling population movement. The cedula was mandatory for all Filipinos aged 18 and over and was used to keep tabs on who was allowed to leave or enter certain areas, as well as to collect taxes from the population. During the American period, the cedula was further developed and expanded to include more personal data and identification features. It became an important tool for the colonial government to establish a centralized and modern system of governance and taxation. The organization of the cedula system became a model for other colonial territories as well. Today, the cedula continues to play an important role in the Philippines as a form of identification for all citizens aged 18 and over. It is required for various transactions including opening a bank, applying for a passport, and voting elections. Now let's proceed to the next topic, direct taxes, urbana, and industria. In 1878, the Philippines was still under Spanish colonial rule. Direct taxes were imposed on Filipinos living in urban areas and engaging in industrial activities. The urbana tax was levied on urban properties or land, particularly those located within cities and towns. The industria tax was imposed on industrial or manufacturing activities carried out by individuals or businesses. The UNI or Urbana Industria was commonly seen as a burden by many Filipinos, particularly the working class who had to pay directly for their home and businesses. Moreover, the tax system was not progressive, as the rate applied to every taxpayer's property was fixed, regardless of their income or wealth. Despite its limitations, the UNI tax was a significant step forward for the development of the Philippines during the Spanish colonial era. It introduced a more structured and standardized approach to taxation, which helped to regulate local economies and strengthen governance. However, the Urbana Industria tax was ultimately abolished following the Philippine Revolution of 1896, which marked the beginning of the country's struggle for independence from Spanish colonial rule. The tax was seen as a symbol of oppression and exploitation, fueling the revolutionary spirit among the Filipino people. While the UNI tax had contributed to the development of urban areas and industries, it had also deepened social inequality and strengthened the Spanish colonial regime's grip on the country. Next is indirect taxes, customs duties. Customs duties were one of the significant sources of revenue for the Spanish colonial government in the Philippines. These are form of indirect tax imposed on imported goods. This means that the tax burden is ultimately borne by the consumer, who pays a higher price for the imported product. Customs duties vary according to the category of the goods being imported, and the rates are set by the government. These taxes were collected by customs officials stationed at ports and border checkpoints. The purpose of customs duties was to regulate trade, protect domestic industries, and generate income for the colonial administration. The collection of customs duties plays an important role in the country's economy as it contributes to the government's revenue. The Bureau of Customs is responsible for assessing, collecting, and enforcing these duties on behalf of the government. Now let's proceed to the monopolies and tobacco monopoly from 1781 to 1882. From 1781 to 1882, the Spanish colonial government established a tobacco monopoly in the Philippines. The monopoly involved the control of the production, sale, and distribution of tobacco products by a government-appointed agency known as Tabacalera. It was an answer for the need to raise money to defend the island from Muslim warriors who live in the unconquered part of the Philippines. This monopoly created huge profits for the Spanish government, as well as for the individual tobacco growers who were granted concessions in exchange for their loyalty. However, this monopoly also had a negative consequences for the Philippine economy and the local population. The monopoly led to the exploitations of farmers and the suppression of local industries that could have competed with the Spanish government's monopoly. The high taxes and fees associated with the tobacco production and distribution also led to the hardship of many Filipinos and contribute to the country's economic instability. Overall, the tobacco monopoly illustrates the consequences of monopolistic market and the negative effects it can have on small businesses, local economies, and the overpopulation. While monopolies may provide economic advantages for a small group of people, they can also create significant inequalities and undermine economic progress. That is all for my part. Now here's Lance to further discuss the taxation during Spanish Philippines and under Americans.
So, thank you, Claro, for that wonderful presentation. So, let's go to the next part, which is the forced labor, polo y servicio, falas and caídas, and prestación personal. Forced labor or polo y servicio is a character of Spain colonial taxation and was required from the Filipinos. It is useful in defending the territory of the colony and augmenting the labor required working on the public projects, agricultural lands, or providing personal services to the Spanish authorities, local elites, or the church. So the Polo e Servicio system is implemented in the 16th century, required the Filipino men to render forced labor for a certain number of days each year, which is 60 days. So, palas, it is the absence of payment for labor rendered. Here, the payment for the labor is corrupted by the Spaniards. While on the other hand, kaidas, it is referred to the arbitrary arrest and detention of the individuals for forced labor purposes. So later on, in the mid 16th century, Polo y Servicio would be called Prestación Personal or Personal Service. And it is reduced the number of labor days from 60 to 15 days per year. Let's go to the corruption of the principales. So, corruption of the principales throughout the Philippine history, corruption among the principales has been a problem due to a number of variables including their access to resources, a lack of monitoring, and existing systems of the government. The principales who held positions of authority and influence within their communities were frequently prone to engage in corrupt acts. So, the principales frequently cooperated with the Spanish authorities throughout the time of the Spanish colonialism in their um, capacity as intermediaries for the colonial government and the residents of the area. This position of the authority and power, nevertheless, also presented the potential for corruption. Some principales use their positions for personal benefits, taking the money intended for the good of the community through bribery, embezzlement, and misappropriation. So they use their ties to the colonial authority to their advantage in order to benefit for their fortune and their personal agendas. Um, so let's go to the next topic, which is Mariano Herbosa writes to Jose Rizal about taxes. So Mariano Herbosa was married to Lucia Alonso Rizal, which is the sister of our very own Dr. Jose Rizal. So that's the quick trivia for you guys. So let's go to the excerpt from the letter of Mariano Herbosa to Jose Rizal. So, the tone of the letter suggests that the taxes are a significant source of misery and hardship for the Filipinos. Mariano Herbosa acknowledges that the topic is vast and complex. And despite of the limitations, Herbosa attempts to convey at least half of the story to give Rizal an understanding for the situation. So the letter highlights that the various types of taxes imposed, such as on irrigated rice land and dry land crops like sugarcane. The taxation system appears inconsistent and arbitrary, with the rates of being increased for the successful harvest but not reduced for the poor ones. So the taxation of the residential lots seems to lack fixed rules, and it follows the whims of the authorities, leading to confusion and discontent among the residents. The absence of the transparent receipts further adds to the challenges, as they do not specify the amount paid and the lack of necessary signatures. So, overall, the Mariano Herbosa's letters to Rizal conveys the hardship and complexities associated with the tax system during their time, highlighting the arbitrary nature of the taxation, the lack of transparency, and the negative consequence for the local residents. It serves to inform Jose Rizal about the prevailing conditions and potentially to seek his insights or support in addressing these taxation issues. So that's all for my report. Let's go back to this topic. So I have a question for you guys. What is your feeling about this forced labor?
I would just like to add something to what you have already said. As I've recalled from a documentary that I've watched, Under this system, Filipinos were required to provide unpaid labor on public projects such as building infrastructure, constructing churches, and even bridges that are still standing today. But the historical significance of it was already forgotten, and some of it were vandalized and were not maintained. As for its impact naman, I think it disrupted the traditional economic activities, which then made it stagnant because Filipinos were forced to divert their time and resources toward unpaid labor, which prohibited the farmers at the time to focus on their own lands and livelihoods. Additionally, the forced labor system contributed to the exploitation and impoverishment of the local population as they were subjected to harsh working conditions and minimal compensation.
And now for the next topic, which will be presented by yours truly, Rain Manginsay, taxation under the Americans. So the topics to be discussed is to make the economy self-sufficient, appraising of land value was influenced by political and familial factors, and then lastly, tax evasion among the elites. In the early American regime from the period of 1898 to 1901, the country was ruled by American military governors. Then in 1902, the first civil government was established under William H. Taft. However, it was only during the term of second civil governor, Luke E. Wright, that the Bureau of Internal Revenue or BIR was created through the passage of Reorganization Act number 1189 dated July 2, 1904, and on August 1, 1904, the BIR was formally organized and made operational under the Secretary of Finance, Henry Ide, which is the author of the Internal Revenue Law of 1904, with John S. Ford as the first collector or commissioner. The first organization started with 69 employees, which consisted of a collector, vice collector, and one chief clerk, one law clerk, one records clerk, and three division chiefs to make the economy self-sufficient. So during the Philippines-American colonial period, the American authorities implemented taxation policies with the aim of making the economy more self-sufficient. The colonial government sought to generate revenue to fund public infrastructure, improve public services, and promote economic development. Here are some ways in which taxation was utilized to achieve economic self-sufficiency. So the first one would be the implementation of direct taxes. So the colonial government introduced direct taxes such as income tax and property tax to broaden the tax base and generate revenue from individuals and businesses. So the BIR was established in 1904 to enforce and collect these taxes. By imposing direct taxes, the government aimed to shift the burden of taxation from primarily indirect taxes to individuals with higher income or property ownership. Next is the indirect taxes, such as import and export duties, excise taxes, and consumption taxes were imposed on various goods and commodities. So these taxes were intended to encourage domestic production and consumption while generating revenue for the government. By imposing tariffs on imported goods, the colonial government aimed to protect and promote local industries, making the economy more self-sufficient. Third is the land tax. So the implementation of a land tax system aimed to encourage efficient land utilization and generate revenue from landowners. So the government introduced land registration and assessment process to establish the value of land for taxation purposes. By taxing land, the authorities sought to capture a portion of the economic value generated by landowners and encourage the productive use of land resources. Next is the revenue from natural resources. So the colonial government also collected revenue from the exploitation of natural resources such as mining and timber. Taxes and royalties were imposed on companies engaged in extracting and utilizing these resources, ensuring that the government received a share of the profits generated from the exploitation. Lastly is the modernization of tax administration. So the American authorities sought to modernize tax administration and improve tax collection efficiency. They established the BIR to enforce tax laws, introduced standardized accounting practices, and implemented better record-keeping system. These efforts aim to enhance tax compliance and increase revenue collection thereby contributing to overall self-sufficiency of the economy. By implementing a combination of direct and indirect taxes, promoting local industries and modernizing tax administration, the American colonial government aimed to create a self-sufficient economy in the Philippines. The revenue generated from taxation was used to finance public infrastructure projects, improve education and healthcare systems, and foster economic development initiatives during that period. So next is the appraising of land value was influences by political and familial factors. So the political factors played a role in the assessment of land values, as individuals with political connections or influence could potentially receive preferential treatment or have their land undervalued for tax purposes. So this could lead to a lower tax burden for them compared to the actual value of their land. Political pressure or corruption might have influenced tax assessors or local officials responsible for determining land values. So familial factors, particularly the influence of powerful land-owning families, also influence land value appraisal. Some wealthy families with extensive land holdings may have been able to exert their influence to ensure that their properties were appraised at lower values, thereby reducing their tax liabilities. In some cases, familial ties or social connections could have influenced assessment process, leading to inconsistencies and disparities in the valuation of land for tax purposes. Tax evasion among the elites. So the Sakada case, 1924. This case involved the evasion of income taxes by sugar planters and the hacienda owners. The BIR accused them of underreporting the wages paid to sakadas, or sugar plantation workers, to avoid higher tax liabilities. So the Bustamante case, 1933, George Bustamante, a prominent Filipino businessman, was accused of tax evasion. It was alleged that he concealed his income and assets, including luxury vehicles, to evade taxes. So the case received significant attention at this time due to Bustamante's high social standing. Next is the oil companies case on 1936. So several major oil companies, including Standard Vacuum Oil Corporation, were accused of evading taxes by manipulating the importation and valuation of petroleum products. The BIR alleged that these companies conspired to understate the value of imported oil to lower their tax obligations. So these cases represent some of the instances where the elites were implicated in tax evasion during the American colonial period. However, it is important to note that information on specific cases may be limited due to the historical context and availability of records. The extent of tax evasion during that period may have been more widespread than documented cases that suggest. So guys, let me know your thoughts regarding these three cases.
So just to give my insights regarding sa topics discussed by Rin, specifically yung influences by political and familial factors, as well as yung sa tax evasion among the elite. So I think that it's really sad that it is still seen and still so rampant in today's time na political and familial influences are used to gain leverage. And what's sad is hindi lang siya applicable sa land and sa taxes, but in so many more issues existing in our country. So it is beyond sad and disappointing that some of these elites have even gained the positions of government. This somehow tells a narrative na we won't see an end to these types of issues anytime soon.
For my insights regarding dun sa mga cases, dun sa Sakada case, yung first case, na-expose nito yung na-expose ng case yung loopholes ng tax system dito sa bansang Pilipinas, and also na-highlight din yung unequal treatment between rich people and poor people pagdating naman sa ating justice system. That's all.
Good day, my name is Karen Claire Villaluna, and I will be discussing the part 2 of topic 2, which is the taxation under the Americans. So beginning with the Internal Revenue Law of 1904, it was modeled after the Internal Revenue Law, which was then enforced in the United States. This became the basic structure for the formation of Bureau of Internal Revenue here in the Philippines. So on July 2, 1904, BIR was created, and on August 1, 1904, that was when it was formally organized and became operational under Henry Ide, who was the Secretary of Finance at that time and the Internal Revenue Law author as well, along with John S. Hord as the first collector. So, BIR began with 69 employees consisting of a collector, vice collector, one chief clerk, one law clerk, one records clerk, three divisions chief. So, BIR was charged with the supervision of the collection of all other taxes accruing in part or wholly to the insular treasury, also the cash pool tax, which is of general application, even if the proceeds accrue exclusively sa provincial and municipal treasuries. So, Internal Revenue Law of 1904 also imposed consumption taxes in the form of specific taxes like stamp and poll taxes and sales taxes. It also created excise tax on businesses and manufacturing and certain occupations. So, it is listed here the following items that inimposa ng tax. So, license taxes on firms dealing with alcoholic beverages and tobacco products, excise tax on alcoholic beverages and tobacco products, taxes on banks and bankers, document stamp taxes, cedula, taxes on insurances and insurance companies, taxes on forest products, minings and concessions, taxes on businesses and manufacturing, and lastly is occupational taxes. So, what we see here is the tax rates of the Internal Revenue Law of 1904. So, under annual license taxes, we have brewers, distillers whose daily output is 4 hectoliters or less. Ayan, we can see here the tax rates. So, everything here is expressed in peso. Next is the tax rates for alcohol and tobacco products. Ayan. And even matches. Ayan, on each gross of matches of not over 120 sticks to a box and over 120 sticks to a box, a proportional additional tax and 0.40. And then next is bank and bankers and personal cedula or poll tax and insurance companies. And here we have taxes on forest products. So, the various provinces in the Philippine Islands are divided into clauses A and B, and the various native trees were divided into 4 groups. On each cubic meter of timber cut in any public forest or forest reserves in any of the provinces of the Philippine Islands for domestic sale or consumption or for export follows these tax rates. Ayan. Next is the taxes imposed on mining companies, on business, manufacturers, and occupations. Next one, we have the Simmons Tariff Act of 1913. So, it was also called the Revenue Act of 1913. It was enacted in the United States in October 1913. Its purpose is to reduce levies on manufactured and semi-manufactured products to eliminate the duties on most raw materials. So, yung tariffs, ito yung taxes imposed sa mga imported products. So, its purpose is to raise revenues, protect domestic industries, ayan, mga ganyan. So, it lowered the average tariff rates from 40% to 27%. It also introduced federal income tax in the US. So, ito yung mga list of goods that were exempted from tariffs. So, raw wool, cattle, sheep, wheat, eggs, meat products, iron ore, pig iron, coal, and lumber. And as for the income tax under Simon's Tariff Act of 1913, it levied 1% on income taxes above $3,000 for single filers, 4,000 for joint filers, 6% rates on income above 500,000. So, you may ask, bakit siya kasali dito sa report when Simon's Tariff Act of 1913 is imposed and imposed sa US. So, Simon's Tariff Act of 1913 removed all restrictions stated in the Payne-Aldrich Tariff Act. So, stated kasi sa Payne-Aldrich Tariff Act na rice pag-export ng rice, sugar, and tobacco is restricted. So, under Simon's Tariff Act of 1913, those restrictions were removed. This resulted in exports in the United States to rise from 50 to 70%. So, ibig sabihin nito, yung mga products in the Philippines, like sugar, yan, tobacco, and rice, is nakakapasok sila sa US freely. So, exports reached 85% by 1939 here in the Philippines, while imports, while 65% imports came from the US. So, yun nga, Philippine sugar industry developed and expanded. Next one is the income tax. So, United States income tax laws of 1913 and 1916 were made applicable to the Philippines beginning March 1, 1913 to December 31, 1918. It was enforced and administered by the Internal Revenue Office of the Philippine government. March 7, 1919, Act number 2833, or also known as the Philippine Income Tax Law, was passed. So, under this Act number 2833, it is stated that there shall be levied, assessed, collected, and paid annually upon the entire net income received in the preceding calendar year from all sources by every individual. So, it just simply states that every individual should pay respective taxes. And Act number 2833 was amended several times and is now embodied in the Commonwealth Act number 466, which became effective July 1, 1931. So, yun nga, Act number 2833 was amended and ngayon ano na siya, under Commonwealth Act 466, under Title 2, which the provisions of applies only to incomes received from January 1st, 1939. So, ito yung tax table from the Revenue Act of 1913 and in comparison siya sa tax table ng 1939 here in the Philippines. Next one is the inheritance tax. So, inheritance tax is state tax system in the Philippines featured two components. Number 1 is the inheritance tax and number 2 is the estate tax. So, July 1, 1916, inheritance tax was imposed by Act number 2601, which is an act to tax inheritances, legacies, and other acquisitions. So, it is stated dito sa inheritance tax that the burden of the inheritance tax shall be borne by the beneficiaries of the descent. Unlike sa estate tax, iba siya sa estate tax kasi kapag sa estate tax, the burden of the tax shall be borne by the state of the descent or not the beneficiaries. So, Section 86 of Commonwealth Act number 466 states that in addition to the state tax, there shall be levied, assessed, collected, and paid an inheritance tax equal to the sum of the percentage of the value of the individual shares of each heir or beneficiary in the net estate after deducting the amount of the real estate tax or every of every descent, whether a resident or non-resident of the Philippines. And January 1, 1973, inheritance tax was repealed under the Presidential Decree number 69 and was integrated into the state tax. So, um, it was repealed for practical administrative reasons. So, the difficulty of determining administering inheritance tax arise when there is an uncertainty with the will provided by the testator. So, like, for example, the heir who will receive the inheritance remain uncertain years after the death of the descent, or when the heirs are undetermined for a number of years while the will is being contested. And so yung mga ganitong cases like this is nagkukos ng difficulty sa valuation and collection ng inheritance tax, which results either sa loss or lag sa realization ng revenue sa part ng government. So, Presidential Decree number 69 provided for 16 tax brackets and a tax-exempt value of 10,000. So, ito yung estate tax schedule provided in the Presidential Decree number 69. So, these amendments were made as part of the reform measures that were meaning to increase the financial resources of the government. So, to make the tax system responsive sa requirements of a developing country, and as I stated earlier nga, regarding the inheritance tax being amended and finally repealed under this decree and integrated sa estate tax for practical administrative reasons din. So, the last one is the National Lottery. So, before the first sweepstakes draws that was conducted in 1932, lottery successes in the Philippines could be dated as early as 1833 under the private enterprises called Empresa de Reales Loteria Espanolas de Filipinos. It was even said that Dr. Jose Rizal won an amount of money in the 1892 draw. So, ayan. Loteries were conducted by Spanish government to generate revenues. However, nahinto siya when the outbreak of the Philippine Revolution happened. And by 1930, doon lang nagkaroon ng idea na i-revive ulit yung lottery games. And by 1932, the first sweepstakes draw was conducted by the government. So, ang purpose ng first sweepstakes draw is to fund sports events, sports projects for the Filipino youth. So, the first beneficiary is the Philippine Amateur Athletic Federation, or the PAAF. So, ayan, nagkaroon pa ng ibang sweepstakes draws under the National Charity Sweepstakes. So, ang beneficiaries nila is yung Philippine Tuberculosis Society, or the PTS. So, ayun nga, rather than limit the sweepstakes to the benefit of the youth or fighting tuberculosis, the legislators thought na it would be good to institutionalize this sweepstake draws. So, kaya by October 13, 1934, Philippine Charity Sweepstakes was created. So, pinalitan niya yung National Charity Sweepstakes. And by June 18, 1954, Republic Act 1169 was enacted into law, providing charity sweepstakes and lotteries once a month. So ito yung Republic Act na nag-aalaw sa pag-held ng charity sweepstakes and lotteries even if there are no sweepstakes draws and races. So yun, ever since the Philippine Charity Sweepstakes has remained to be an indispensable charity arm of the government, frequently summoned to provide funding or essential health and welfare activities and projects nationwide. So that would be all for our report. Thank you.